Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm excited to share this information beyond the boundaries of Arizona. I'm going to be talking more specifically about design for your local site situations and also reducing wildfire risks. So Catherine provided a great overview of what's going on nationally. I want you now to imagine your own site. And this sort of work can take place at the residential scale, commercial scale, public buildings, parks, streetscapes, stormwater management basins. There's a wide variety of locations where you can grow edible trees. I'll make a note that edible trees are, what I mean by that is trees that produce fruits, nuts, seeds, and pods that are edible. I have been asked whether we eat the bark, leaves, or roots. And while you can use some portions of trees that way, that's not our focus. So throughout this, I'll be referring to information prepared at the LEAF Network website. You'll see the link for that at the end of the presentation. First of all, when you design, learn the edible trees that can grow in your area. You'll be surprised that this photo array here shows just a sampling of the types of edible trees that can be grown in Arizona. Not all of these grow at every elevation, though. So it's important to understand where the characteristics of the trees and what favorable elevations, water use, and chill hour requirements affect their growth. Interestingly, on this graph, which is oriented towards Arizona, you'll see that the mid-desert, that would be the butterscotch-colored column, second from the left, has the largest number of edible trees that can grow there and thrive. The reason for this is that the mid-altitude deserts can grow both deciduous trees that are sort of familiar, like apples and peaches and pears, but it also supports native edible trees, which are very abundant in production and were important sources of food for indigenous populations. Water use is incredibly important in the desert and throughout the country, so knowing how much water the tree needs will be part of your design work. To create a design, you start by understanding the site you're building on or growing on. This is just a residential example, but it's extremely important to know where the utilities are, whether you have gutters, downspouts, what the topography of the site is, what direction the wind comes from. There's a number of microclimate elements and also physical elements that affect design. You don't have to create a map when you do a planting design, but it is helpful to check tree spacing and other important elements. Sun angles are extremely important everywhere. In the desert, because we're at Tucson, which is sort of the geographic center of this, is at a low latitude, the summer sun is mostly in the northern sky. So in the summer, the north side of a tree or a house will get the majority of sunlight. This is important in design because you want to place hardy native edibles west and northwest of houses where they can cast shade on the house and also take the brunt of that hot sunlight. The afternoon temperatures routinely over 100 degrees last summer here in Tucson and even higher in Phoenix. In the heat-sensitive trees, those that are vulnerable to too much heat, can be placed east of a house, and that way they get shade from the harsh afternoon sun. In the winter, the sun is low in the southern sky, and you want cold-sensitive trees placed on the east and southeast side of the house, where they can get the morning sun and be warmed all day. But deciduous trees that need a certain amount of chill hours can be put north of the house, where they'll have deeper shade. Cold air drains from the top of high elevation areas down the slopes and then pools in the bottom of the topography. So in terms of placement in our location, you want cold-sensitive trees placed on the slope, preferably a south-facing slope, so that cold air passes by them and pools below them. Trees that need chill hours can be placed in the bottom of drainages where they'll get sufficient cooling. Strong prevailing winds are important everywhere. In this photo, if you look at the very base of the front tree and then follow a line vertically upwards, you'll see that the mass of the tree is tilted to the right. That's because prevailing winds have reshaped this tree permanently. You need to understand your local prevailing winds, and they will be different in different locations. You can do this by collecting wind data or observing wind-shaped trees in your area. And then you position trees according to the winds. So hardy natives, edible trees, are placed upwind of the house and upwind of sensitive trees to protect them, whereas sensitive trees are placed downwind of the natives or the buildings. But you don't place sensitive trees in locations where wind is pinched, such as a canyon topography or between several buildings. If you water trees outside the drip line, this will encourage wider root growth and stronger tree anchoring. Trees have an optimal growth, and you need to know that. The Leaf Network website contains information on wind, solar placement, and tree sizing. So first of all, no matter what size tree, you want to place it greater than 2 feet from buildings, walls, and curbs, preferably farther than that. Avoid putting trees, edible trees, next to shared walls because part of your produce is going to be on the other side of that wall, and it could heave the wall. And be sure to follow wildfire guidelines if you're in a fire-prone area. Some trees are very short-lived. Some live 300 years or more. Some only live 30 or 40 years. So if you're using young trees with a short lifespan, you want to have access to them. So create pathways that can provide for the flow of both people and vehicles and machinery to get in, to remove trees that are past their lifespan and put in new ones. Pollination is important. If your tree is pollinated by bees, you want a cross-pollinating tree within 100 feet. If they're wind-pollinated, you want them within 50 feet of each other. And you want to provide space for the trees to grow to their mature size. So plant trees, fruit trees, at least 30 feet apart. And when I say fruit trees, I'm really generalizing to all edible trees. Semi-dwarf and dwarf trees obviously require less space. You also might want to consider multi-story planting, which Catherine talked a lot about, where you're adding edible understory species underneath the edible trees where they can benefit from the shade and share the water and create a more diverse and abundant system. Tucson, Arizona gets 12 inches of rainfall per year. Our evaporation rate is 80 inches per year. So I've been asked, why bother to harvest water in a location where it hardly ever rains? And my answer is, why wouldn't you harvest water there? These are examples of passive water harvesting basins where you're collecting water that falls directly over the tree and its root zone. On the upper right, you're collecting water from a small micro watershed into a micro basin. In the lower left, you're collecting water from a larger localized watershed into a swale. And in the bottom right is a subdivision that's been built where all of the tree plantings you see are actually depressed basins, and it serves as both stormwater management and to support these edible trees. Stormwater is another abundant source, and the more hardscape you have in an urban environment, the more water you have. In Tucson, it's legal to cut the curb and invite water into a depressed basin. There are requirements for this and specifications, and you do have to get a permit. But it's increasingly used to create shady trees, and you see here an example that's still under construction. At a commercial site, you can put in loose curb, or it's anchored curve, but it's not continuous, and let water flow to a depressed planting basin. You'll see two views here of a target in Tucson where this is being conducted. Look at the shade those trees cast on the cars. I'm sure if you live in the desert or hot areas, you've trolled for shade. You can also incorporate tanks to increase the water harvesting capacity and increase the time period when water is available. Site design should incorporate passive water harvesting, active water harvesting in tanks if you want to do that, collection of air conditioning condensate, gray water. Every water resource is important. And here's an example of a mid-elevation desert design that takes all of these elements, wind, sun, size of the trees, water availability, into account in the design. Now, you do have to anticipate and prepare for extreme conditions. Extreme cold and frost can be dealt with at the design stage by carefully placing your trees in appropriate microclimates, by choosing varieties that are late blooming and cold hardy, and in an actual cold event, you can wrap sensitive trees. In this case, a pear tree that was already blooming had a late season snow, and all we did was tarp it up and it did produce fruit. You can also put lamps under these structures to warm them up. For extreme heat and drought, you want to place sensitive trees east of hardy natives or buildings to get shade. Don't prune up and expose the trunk unless you've given that trunk time to harden out. So you do your pruning in winter and give the trunk time to get used to it. You can also hang tarps and provide extra water and mulch. Prepare for intense storms by keeping your trees well pruned so that they're not damaged by the storms. And of course, design and prepare for fire in wildfire-prone areas. I'm using an example here from the semi-arid grasslands of Sonoyta, Arizona, which is about an hour southeast of Tucson. The fire regime here is a frequency of 2 to 5 years for this semi-arid grassland. This keeps the woody species from encroaching on grasses, but everything becomes fuel except rocks. The fires are usually fast and flashy, and they're driven by wind and the type of fuel available. As it turns out, my partner has a house down in Sonoyta. There were so many wildfires there last spring that I decided I better get out and do some serious pruning. And I happened to start pruning 4 days before we had an actual fire sweep through that neighborhood. The fire was lit by lightning, burned 1,300 acres, passed over 155 homes, and took 5 buildings. So the slides you're going to see now show the pre-trimming and the post-fire effects. Obviously, go to firewise.org. It's an incredible resource for information for neighborhoods and individuals on how to prepare for fires. This presentation is based on Firewise principles, starting with the principle of defensible space. The area between a structure and an oncoming fire where nearby vegetation is modified to reduce the fire's intensity and the ability to spread. There are 3 zones, and you want to do management of all 3 of these zones to keep your structure safe. So at this particular house in Sonoyta, we cut oaks and manzanitas that were very close to the residence. We trimmed junipers, manzanitas, and other species that were a little bit farther away from the building. And we heavily watered the orchard because deciduous trees that have high moisture content are a little bit fire resistant. So also maintain a diverse, healthy landscape, and that helps to deflect insects and diseases that resist fires. Time the fire prevention activities carefully. You're going to prune in winter when the trees are taking a rest. Rake in April or sooner. I would say much sooner. In fact, I'm going to go out and start raking right now. It is April, but I should have started sooner for this year. Cut grasses and annuals when it's dry. They say the wildfire season in Sonoyta is May through August, but it's really getting much longer. And we've already had a fire, wildfire in the vicinity of Tucson, even in December. So you all know the wildfire season is getting much more aggressive. You're going to remove dead, diseased, and low-hanging branches. And here's an example of the tangle of manzanita, which is an edible shrub, which has a lot of low-growing branches. That's also typical of junipers, which are common plants down in Sonoyta. Oaks also tend to drape their boughs down if they're not trimmed up. Here's a picture of trimmed bushes and trees. Do not plant understory if you're in a wildfire area, if you're in zones 1 or 2. If it is present, remove it. This is a picture of understory growing naturally in the neighborhood, but not near a house. After the fire, a similar location with understory definitely laddered up into the tree, heavily damaged the tree. So that's a good lesson in getting rid of understory if it's close to a residence. Rake the litter from around buildings and from underneath trees. 3 to 5 feet away from the structure is the recommendation. I actually bagged up this litter, took it really far away from the house. I don't want to waste organic matter in the desert, but I don't want it near the house. You want to remove trimmings from the defensible space. I had a very bad night knowing I had piled a bunch of dead wood up next to the house and had not drug it around to a safe staging area to be removed. On the right, you see the branches in a safe staging area. By the time the trimming was done 4 days before the fire, we had removed 2 long bed trailer loads 4 feet high of manzanita, oak, and juniper trimmings. Avoid vertical connectivity because the fire will ladder up from grasses to shrubs to small trees to large trees. On the upper right, you see an oak tree we're trying to protect next to the house. And on the bottom right, the sequence of trimming as I'm starting to remove the the grasses and the manzanita from around the oak. Also, that lower limb on the oak needed to be trimmed. This is what happened after the fire. You'll see that the fire footprint, and I got these slides the morning after the fire passed through the neighborhood. The fire footprint went all the way to the house wall and the patio wall, but it did not ladder up the oak tree. Remove horizontal connectivity of fuels near structures. So here we're going to thin out the undergrowth, undershrubs, remove smaller shrubs that are creating connectivity between them. And in this way, you're reducing the ability of the fire to leap from canopy to canopy of shrubs. Here again is the fire footprint. Went all the way past the trimmed juniper and manzanitas, all the way up to the oak, but did not ignite the house or the oak. The orchard, which is located somewhat distant from the house, was watered really, really heavily before this fire. It does have wood chip mulch on it, but the mulch did not burn because there was a lot of moisture under the soil. A grapevine in the corner did burn, and you'll see that the native shrubs outside the fence of this orchard burned as well. Also, the bird net melted. Prepare for wildfires so we can help those who fight the fires. I'm so grateful to the Sonoyta-Elgin Fire District and the State Fire Department, the State Forestry, and fire departments from all over the Southwest showed up to fight this fire on a moment's notice in the June heat. And we're just so grateful that they saved most of the houses. In our neighborhood, we happen to have a tank that could be gravity fed, but the water was all turned off. The electricity was turned off as soon as that fire started, so you can't really fight your own fire. Some resources you might want to check out, leafnetworkaz.org. At that site, we have Growing Edible Arizona Forests, an illustrated guide. While this is focused towards Arizona, it's very applicable to other locations, and the design principles are universal. By the way, the mission of the LEAF Network is to link people with the benefits of edible trees and to support edible trees with people's stewardship. At this website, There are 50 pages of information and over 100 PDFs that you can download that provide a whole lot of detail about the stuff I'm just briefly talking about. Also at the website, you'll find the Arizona Edible Tree Directory that provides detailed information about 55 edible trees and 28 edible understory plants, including water use, size, chill requirements, cultural history, a wealth of information about each of these trees. So thank you very much. I encourage you to go to the Leaf Network website, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.